welcome to the Change Loves Company podcast, where I sit down with the creatives, fundraisers, social entrepreneurs, artists and activists, all with one thing in common. They're changing the world for the better through their work. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm recording on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be. I'm Dominique Antarakis, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Weh Yeoh. Weh has a pretty impressive background and career. He's worked internationally and in Australia, his home country, in the social impact space for more than 2 decades. He's a founder of a charity, OIC Cambodia, which is an initiative that aims to establish speech therapy as a profession in that country. He has a BA in physiotherapy from the University of Sydney and an MA in development studies from the University of New South Wales. He's volunteered with people with disability in Vietnam, interned in India, studied Mandarin in Beijing, and milked yaks in Mongolia. He started OIC in 2013 and handed over leadership to a local Cambodian team in 2017. He has since co-founded UMBO, a social enterprise bridging the gap for rural Australians to access allied health services. We spoke about his book, Redundant Charities, and why charities should be thinking about redundancy right from the very beginning of their setup. I'm delighted to have Weh Yeoh in the studio with me today. Welcome, Weh.
Thank you so much, Dominique. It's so great to be here in this wonderful studio.
Really good to have you. So, Weh, you have written a book. Here it is, Redundant Charities. It feels like a little bit of a gauntlet has been put down to the charity sector as a kind of a, okay, guys, we need to talk about this. How has the book been received so far?
Firstly, I'm just really glad that you referred to it as a gauntlet, which I've never heard before. And I'm glad you said it was put down as opposed to slapped into someone's face. I think speaking to a little bit about why the book was written in the first place and the background, I think we need to have more critical discussion about how to do good and how charities can achieve that good or not. And I think that's because charities have been operating in effectively the same way for decades, if not centuries, without really a critical lens being put towards it. At the same time, I do feel because of some of the power dynamics and also cultural reasons within this country, we're not actually that good at critical discussion compared to some of the more stereotypical places in the world that have more rigorous debate around the dinner table, for example. So in answer to the question, how has it been received? I think in general it's been received pretty well, but that's only the thing that I've hear about. It's only the people that actually reach out or respond or write reviews or, put their hand up in a panel discussion to provoke conversation. And then there's probably a bunch of people that haven't received it particularly well, but I haven't necessarily heard from them. And then there's sort of this middle ground, I guess, of the events that I've done where I've talked about the book and people have put their hand up and had really good rebuttals to some of the arguments that have been put forward in the book that have really made me think more critically about my own writing, about my own arguments, which is great. And again, that's the whole point of the book is to, as you said, throw the gauntlet down to start that discussion so we can eventually have charities that are more effective.
Yeah, look, as someone who's worked in the sector now about 20 plus years, when I saw the title, I was like, how dare he? How very dare he? And then I was like, nope. I need to read this because, as you say, it's sort of time for the sector to really take a good, long, hard look at itself, right? I'm going to read a little passage from the foreword of the book and then ask a couple of questions. So you say, in order to propose a new model of charities, it's necessary for me to showcase some of the worst of charities and show why their design often prevents them from making themselves redundant. The key word to highlight in that sentence is design. Charities are the way they are, not because people who start charities are bad, but because the structure of charities is inherently flawed. This is one of the reasons why charities so often go wrong, but to change an entire sector, we first need to change our perspectives. So before I ask you what a redundant charity is specifically, what are some of the ways that charities, go wrong when it comes to design?
You read that so well. I feel like you should have been the narrator for my audiobook rather than myself. So I think making that point is really important, firstly, to take the pressure off people feeling defensive. And I think the title of the book is clearly there to provoke, to make people feel uncomfortable which then hopefully, if they're brave enough, like yourself, to pick up the book and read it. In terms of the design of the charities, the front cover of the book really illustrates what I think a lot of charities are stuck on, which is a hamster wheel, where they're stuck on this wheel because they're seeking funding and then they're doing the work that's really good and really important, and then they're justifying why they should get more funding. And then because they're on this wheel, a lot of the energy and effort goes towards maintaining themselves. Once you start a charity, you have a whole lot of incentive to keep it going. You've got people that rely on you for their livelihoods. And so the idea of making a charity redundant is something that's really galling and against the instincts, I think, of a lot of charity leaders. Then you have another hamster wheel, and that's the hamster wheel that communities that charities work for find themselves on too. So in the book, I describe how my background's in physiotherapy. And if you've seen a physio before, you'll know there's a difference between the physiotherapist addressing the symptoms and solving the underlying problem. So if you've got back pain, for example, a physio can help you address these symptoms by giving you massage or something else that feels nice, but you might get a recurrence of that pain a few days later. It's only when they give you the exercises or the advice or the postural correction that you'll have the underlying problem go away. So I believe that most charities are actually working towards just addressing the symptoms, and therefore they keep on working with these communities. These communities don't ever really get fully empowered to solve the problem for themselves. But we can actually do that. And the way we do it is by making the charity redundant, making sure we're handing off the power to local actors so that they can do it for themselves.
And so you're not just, talking about something you don't know anything about. You have actually started a charity over in Cambodia, OIC?
Yeah, OIC Cambodia.
Tell me a little bit about that charity and where it is today.
Yeah, so I've walked the walk in starting the redundant charity, and by that I mean it's set up to have an end date, which is 2030. So I started the charity in 2013, lived in Cambodia for 5 years, and I recognized, along with many other people, that there was a huge gap in terms of basic services for people with disabilities. And that's the lack of speech therapy. There was just no speech therapists in the whole country. Now, there have been people that are flying in and out to do bits and pieces of services or capacity building. But again, speaking to that idea of the hamster wheel, that's essentially a symptom addressing approach. Not to say that that work's pointless or useless or to denigrate that work at all, but that work doesn't have an end date. It just keeps on going. And so what we wanted to do was set up the charity so that the country of Cambodia could have this profession and could drive the growth of it in and of itself. And so in order to do that, we had to set up an end date for that charity being 2030. And by that stage, we hope to have 100 speech therapists that are essentially working within the Cambodian government hospital system or public health system, let's say. So in terms of how it's going, well, I feel like it's a hard question to answer because I'm not really involved in the day-to-day on purpose. But at an arm's distance, it seems to be going pretty much according to plan, with the exception of the usual road bumps that a lot of charities have felt, including COVID, which was devastating, and now USAID pulling out as a major funder. But I'm hopeful that, at least in setting up the intention for the charity to finish in 5 years' time, that determines the kind of work that we do, and then it's more ground up and it's more systems building, as opposed to just addressing the symptoms on top.
So it sounds like you actually started out trying to make that charity redundant at the end. So how had you come to that conclusion so early on?
I think I'd been in and around charities for at least a decade prior, and I'd just sort of seen, similar to yourself probably and similar to a lot of other people, the wastage and the way in which charities, I think, struggle to make a real dent in terms of social impact, despite well-meaning people and despite, in the case of Cambodia, a lot of money. Because when I arrived in Cambodia in 2012, it had the second highest number of charities in the world and the second highest number of UN agencies in the world. And still there were those really yawning and obvious gaps like the one that was identified by this charity. So I think that I just kind of seen enough of this hamster wheel that I told myself if I was ever in a position to influence the direction and structure of a charity, I'd try and make sure that from the beginning, it was set up to be redundant. Now, that goal that I mentioned before, the 100 therapists by 2030, I certainly am certainly not intelligent enough to articulate that by myself. So the intention was there, but it took about a year or so of me working with a bunch of other people to be able to articulate that goal. And then now for that, goal to be set in stone for that charity to follow.
I mean, one of the reasons I think why charities, even if they maybe have a redundancy goal somewhere in the future, we want to cure cancer forever or we want to eliminate poverty or something, there's a dichotomy, isn't there? Because if you're trying to raise money for a need, trying to show or talking about the solution too much, or that, there is actually an end date, can be counterproductive for the charity. So they can tie themselves in knots, right, by sort of trying to show that there's still this massive need. But I do find, I donate to a lot of charities, sometimes a bit scattergun, sometimes I'm a regular giver, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a bit of a soft touch, frankly. But every now and then I'm like, good Lord, what have you solved? What have you actually done? And of course, there's a trend these days for impact reports and, trying to show that there's, progress is being made. But they kind of have to keep talking about the problem as much as they can. And I wouldn't say creating or perpetuating the problem, but the solution is not necessarily as sexy as the need, right?
That's right. And, I talk about the design. We talked about that at the beginning and the forward. Charities aren't really incentivized to solve the problem. And the analogy I think I use in the book is if you've ever been to a dodgy car mechanic and they just tinker away a little bit with your car to keep things humming along for a little bit, but you'll be back there in 6 to 12 months' time with a problem that is maybe related and could have been fixed that first time around. And I feel like it's a somewhat crude analogy, but I feel like there's some parallels there with charities because, as you said, Dominique, they're not really incentivized to completely solve the problem because that eliminates the need for the charity to exist, right? And so it's far better to keep that problem just humming along a little bit, amplifying it, and keep on talking about it. And that's why I think for charities that don't have the redundant charity mindset, as you said, it's very difficult sometimes to actually say, what have you actually achieved in terms of eliminating this particular issue over decades, and despite millions and maybe sometimes billions of dollars that have been donated. So I think for those charities, it's very hard, which is why embracing this kind of mindset is much, much easier if the charity does it from the beginning.
Are there any charities that you think probably couldn't become redundant or that should be exempt from your diktat?
There's absolutely a ton. And there's a ton that I haven't met and thought about. And I've had, I think I mentioned before that at some events that I've been to, people have put their hand up and said, oh, what about this? And my response has been sort of like, oh, okay. So I think broadly speaking, the main counter argument to this book falls under the banner of things are so bad. That there are so many issues and there are certain circumstances where infrastructure doesn't exist for which a charity could hand over. And I would say in that regard, two things. Firstly, I'm sure there are circumstances like that I don't fully comprehend, in which case, until there is something to hand over to, absolutely there needs to be a charity to provide basic services. For example, let's think about like remote Australia or remote part of any country. I think that's a really good example. But the second point I'd make is that sometimes problems seem so overwhelming that it doesn't seem like handing over is possible, in which instance it can be helpful just to take away the scope of the problem and just narrow it down a little bit. So rather than trying to solve global poverty, maybe we'll solve poverty in a couple of districts in favelas in a particular part of, this country, Brazil or whatever. So I think charities sometimes bite off a bit more than they can chew. And this is another thing that I've discovered in writing the book and talking to charities is that, again, going back to your point, it's about talking about the need. It's really inspiring for me as a charity to say, I'm going to solve homelessness across Australia. And then you might have a look at my income and you might say, well, you only generate about $10 million of revenue every year in terms of grants raised or whatever, money raised. So that's not really fitting of the problem that you're trying to solve. It's just not enough resource to be able to do that potentially. And so I think that's something I'd like charities to be a bit more mindful of, is being realistic with actually what resources can I apply to solving this problem. And though it sounds really great and grandiose to say, I'm going to solve this huge problem, maybe that's not realistic.
Mm. So 2 points I'd make there. One is that there's a lot of duplication, right? Like a huge amount of charities doing more or less the same thing. And to be fair, there's a lot of collaboration very often as well. And the other point is that often those grassroots, small scale, just trying to do something good in their community, charities or organizations can have a bigger impact, right? And more of a ripple effect than a massive national charity with a lot of middle management, oversight, and a board which doesn't have a clue and all that sort of stuff. What would you say to that?
I 100% agree. And it's much easier for a smaller charity to make themselves redundant, and I think it's baked within at the fabric of Australian culture, historically at least, to fight for the underdog. It's something that I always grew up with, being born in Australia and living in the 80s and 90s, that, this real kind of strength. We definitely favour underdogs generally, and that's where I think I personally feel a lot more affection, I think, for the smaller charities. Unfortunately, the way the charity sector is operated, it's very common for those that are larger to end up with more resources. So I think the statistic is about 50% of all available funding in Australia goes to the top. I'm going to fluff this. It's about 15, 20 charities roughly. It's certainly not more than 100. It's a double-digit figure. And so you do have these mega charities, mega corporation style, Amazon-like charities that are taking more than their fair share of resources. And yes, sometimes they are contracting or working with smaller charities or collaborating that way. But then you do wonder, though, what if that money went directly to those smaller charities? Could they potentially be more effective and more efficient?
Arundhati Roy actually wrote a book called, Dead Aid, talking about this idea that
Dabisa Moyo.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Talking about the fact that often giving money directly rather than going through a massive agency, whether that's UN or a multinational charity, can be way more effective, which is a sort of a form of that redundancy, right?
It is, and I think we are sort of blindsided, I think, by the idea that scale equals success in the charity world. And that scale that we all want, which comes from the private sector, these stories of Canva went from one person to billions and billions of dollars of value. You could argue that applies beautifully to the private sector. I don't know if it applies to the charity sector, because scale isn't necessarily something that determines the effectiveness of that charity. As we've discussed, the grassroots charities can often do more. Unfortunately, scale is kind of how the world works. So we have wonderful resources like GiveWell is a really good example. That GiveWell is a website and an organization that rates charities according to how effective they are. But pure economics suggests that they can only do that with the larger charities. So there's a whole cadre of smaller charities that are really effective that they just cannot rate because of pure numbers and time and energy. And I think that's a shame. So I would like us to think about the idea that scale isn't necessarily a sign of success, but potentially becoming redundant and being smaller and shrinking into oblivion. That can also be another way in which you can be successful.
Fantastic. So you've pivoted from the charity world to social enterprise, and you run a social enterprise called Umbo. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So now after having started this redundant charity, then moving on and handing off the leadership and coming back to Australia in 2017, I discovered a number of things from a personal perspective, which is firstly, once you set up a charity that doesn't scale, and when your intention is to keep it small and then for it to eventually disappear, it becomes very hard personally to have any savings to actually survive. So I then realized that also if I wanted something to grow, that comes back to that private sector or for-profit model. And that's where I think Umbo fits in well to my personal ambitions, first of all, to be able to survive. And then secondly, to be able to have something that scales that makes sense. So Umbo focuses on regional Australia, on people that are on long wait lists for services like speech and occupational therapy. And we have all of our therapists working online. About 20% of them are typically Australian trained or Australian that have moved overseas and live overseas, maybe with a partner who's got a job in another country, but can still work with Australian people. And then because it's done online, we cut these wait times down from typically 18 months down to 1 or 2 weeks, ideally. So Umbo's social enterprise for 2 reasons. Firstly, the bulk of our clients come from regional Australia, i.e. over 60%. And also 17% of our clients are First Nations people. And then also 50% of our profit, we put it aside. When people can't afford to pay and they're not on any relevant funding schemes like NDIS or Medicare, we can subsidise the cost of their assessments or therapy. And we've done over 300 grand in about 3.5 years of doing this program. And I think about this purely from the perspective of someone who's done charity work and now set up a social enterprise. 300 grand of direct work is a lot of work, because it doesn't, if that was a charity, there'd be all these like admin costs and fundraising costs and other costs as well, which are valid, but 300 grand worth of direct impact is really significant. So I just think the way in which we've structured Umbo is really beautiful, because everything that we do is aligned to growth. And the more growth that we achieve, the more people we can help, the more profit we put aside to be able to help people again. It's a really, really beautiful model.
Someone once said that a social enterprise is a bit like if a charity and a business had a baby.
Yes.
Do you find that it's kind of the best of both worlds, in the sense of you're doing good, but you're generating an income, which, as you say, pays for the good stuff?
I think it can be the best of both worlds. I know that that analogy, and I know the person who said it too, but I think the thing is that I don't feel like social enterprises are like charities in many ways, and I'll explain why. The first thing is that if you're fortunate enough to work in an area where you can create a business that's profitable like Umbo is, then actually you don't have to worry about grant funding. So Umbo's been profitable for a number of years now, and that means that we don't have to worry about philanthropy to prop us up, which is great. So we can make decisions about the business that make sense from a business perspective. And that just gives us so much more freedom. Like if you think about all the time and energy that a traditional charity spends in terms of writing grant applications and then reporting back to the donor and then asking for more money, it's actually really refreshing to be able to run the business and just do good in your day-to-day. But I guess the flip side is that when it comes to seeking support, if we were to look for grant funding or if we were to get pro bono support from corporations, then it's a lot harder, because social enterprises aren't recognised in the same way charities are, and we don't have DGR status. And then there's also a suspicion that I think sometimes some potential partners have about, well, this social enterprise, if we help you, it means that the shareholders will get direct benefit from it as well, which is true, of course, because we have shareholders, which is neither here nor there in my opinion. I guess the point is, though, that if you choose to create a social enterprise and you can make the business operate, which, by the way, is not a given, because there are some social issues that businesses will not be able to operate profitably and effectively in. So in my opinion, we still need charities. But if you're lucky enough to find an area like Umbo has that is profitable, then yes, it gives you a large degree of freedom to do good in a way that's really sustainable.
Do you think redundancy is something that social enterprises should also be looking at down the track?
I have thought about this question a fair bit, and I actually don't really know what the answer is. I can see pros and cons. I think as long as the business is operating in a way that delivers on the social mission, then I still believe that growth is the ultimate goal, because as the business grows, everyone benefits, including shareholders, which I think is important. The shareholders should benefit, because then that means that we're more likely for the business to keep on growing and to actually help more people. So I think at the moment where I'm landing is that, as long as the business stays true to its intentions, which is to do good and doesn't greenwash. And there are some examples, of course, of social enterprises that have been bought out by big conglomerates that have had, the social impact part of their charter wiped. So we wouldn't want that at Umbo for sure. Then I believe that it doesn't need to make itself redundant.
Fantastic. So great place to end our conversation. And Redundant Charities is available for purchase, but we're going to give away a copy today. So if you subscribe to the channel, then we'll pick someone at random and you'll be able to get a copy of the book. Of course, you can also purchase it. And so we'll put a link up as well. Now, Weh, I also asked you to recommend a book for people to read. And I seem to be the only person still reading actual physical books these days because you mentioned it would be on your Kindle. So what book do you have for the audience to keep an eye out for?
I read a book recently this year that had quite a profound impact on me. And I love the title, and it's called Bullshit Jobs. It's a little bit older now, as in I think it was 2017 roughly. Have you read it, Dominique?
No, but I've seen the cover and I've heard of it.
It's a great name for a book. And it basically talks about jobs that don't add any value to society. And by the way, these are jobs that people are self-nominating. So someone would write into the author and say, I'm a corporate lawyer, for example, and this is an example of why my job doesn't add value. And if my job didn't exist, there'd be sort of no difference really. So it sort of starts off with that, but it also talks really about, I think, bureaucracy more broadly, which is something that we all experience. And then it ends on a really positive note by talking about universal basic income, which to me is a fascinating topic as well. So Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, really recommend it.
Fantastic. I will check it out. Weh, it's been fantastic having you in the studio today. Thank you so much for your time and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Dominique. I really appreciate the conversation.